Before we get started, we really want to share with you our plans to take the podcast on the road. This means filming on-the-ground experiences in the U.S. and internationally, with in-the-field, face-to-face video interviews. It's an exciting yet ambitious undertaking, and we know we cannot do it without your help. If you feel inspired to join us in making this a reality, simply head over to the donate link in this episode's description. We cannot thank you enough for your continued support and your commitment to helping us share more of these wild stories and amazing people. We welcome our next guest from the Catskills up in New York, not my hometown, but my home state. And she is the Northeast Carnivore Advocate for the Rewilding Institute. We're going to talk a lot about policy and environments and all sorts of interesting things today. And she is Nadia Steinzor. Nadia, it's incredible to meet you. Thank you for making the time and to go over all of these policy things with us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. Spring is springing here, and it's great to talk to you guys. Really appreciate you having me on the podcast. Anything with wolf in the name is a great thing.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Thank you for, like I said, thanks for joining us and giving up your time. And really just want to start off with where this all began, because you've had such a long career in policy work in general. Just reading through your resume and reading through a lot of the work that you've done in terms of climate and advocacy and wildlife protection and land and things like that. Where did you grow up? Are you native New York? How did policy and all this become into your purview as you sort of grew into your older age?
Yes, my older but not old.
Yes, elder, yeah.
That's what I tell myself. It's a good question. Yeah, I live here in the Catskills, in the Eastern Catskills near Woodstock, New York, and I am extremely fortunate to currently be living on the land where I grew up. I grew up sort of back and forth between the Catskills and New York City. As a kid, my parents purchased the property we live on now before I was born. So I've been up here full time for the last 20 years or so. Lived in DC, which is the quintessential policy mecca, and have also lived in other countries and other places. And I started out my career working more on international relations and development issues. And when I was in DC, I got involved with the Sierra Club and the Sierra Club chapter, and we helped prevent a road from being built through some parkland. And I found that in doing that work, I was pretty pumped about the environmental issues. And I was always a nature kid, always loved being outside, much preferred to be up here in the Catskills than in the city. And everywhere I've lived, I always kind of gravitated to parks and wild spaces and hiking and biking and just being outdoors. And I just at some point had an early midlife crisis in my late 30s and decided to go back to graduate school for environmental policy. And I did that up here in New York. And then I got the degree that I was supposed to go back to DC and use, and just never left. And when I finished graduate school in the early 2000s, I had become involved with a coalition that was run by the Humane Society and a bunch of other organizations called the Coalition to Restore the Eastern Wolf. And I had done quite a bit of graduate school research on the possibility of wolves and large carnivores returning to the Northeast. And I probably should have said that one of the deciding factors for me, it may sound a little corny, but I was trying to decide how to deal with my early midlife crisis. And I was walking through the National Zoo in DC, and I stopped, and there was a wolf looking at me through an enclosure. And it was like, I'm sure we've all had, where we ponder things forever and go back and forth and have all sorts of ambivalence. And then all of a sudden it's like a flash. Yeah, I got to do that. And it was one of those moments. And I also stopped visiting zoos at that point because it was so depressing to see this glorious wild animal behind bars. But that was a real turning point for me. So I pursued that interest in graduate school, and then had the opportunity to help organize the Coalition to Restore the Eastern Wolf in the early 2000s. And then I got involved in land protection and land trusts in the Catskills and nearby regions. And then what happened was that hydraulic fracturing and the oil and gas boom came to the Northeast, and I started hearing about it. and I had a work opportunity to get involved in that. And lo and behold, 12 years went by. So did a lot of policy and regulatory work on trying to reduce the horrific community and environmental impacts of large scale industrial oil and gas development. You guys are in an oil state, so I'm sure you know what I'm talking about.
Just before we get into all the policy and all the things that you've done over the course of your career, because it's such a wide span, what is it about being in the outdoors for you that connects to the work that you're doing, as opposed to being in the concrete jungles of either DC or New York? You're up in the Catskills. So how does that help you foster not only the relationships you might have with the people that you're working to do these policy things with, but also for yourself to be engaged with the natural spaces as opposed to doing it from afar?
Yeah, it's a really important question because I think a lot of people who do this work are driven by, we can say love of the outdoors, but it's really love of the wild and desire to see more wild and to save the wild as we spread into more concrete jungles and our human population grows and we have all of the industrial and developmental impacts on the wild world and our the non-human creatures who are on this journey with us on the planet. So for me, I don't know if it can explain or if anyone can truly explain why some people have more of an affinity for it or feel more connected. I think a lot of it has to do with exposure and not being afraid. There's so much mythology in our modern industrial world about the wild and to be fearful of it. And we've gotten so separate from it. And I think I've been one of those extremely privileged people to have been shown from a very young age that being out in the woods, listening to water, looking at the stars, knowing that there are bears and coyotes and turkey and birds and and fish in the stream right down the slope from me and all of that, and being taught that that's not to be afraid of, but it's something to really value and appreciate. So I think I just had a really good amount of luck in that. And I will say that being involved with the Rewilding Institute and with people who are working to restore and protect large carnivores seem to really have that like deep-seated value system that our wild fellow creatures are extremely important, almost on par with us. I mean, I have to say that's my true belief. And so, yeah, I don't know if it comes from exposure and then just the kind of value system I was raised with around justice and fairness. And I think just extending that to other creatures.
When we talk about environmental policy, because I want to get in this because there's so much I think to peel back the layers of what it might mean. When someone goes into environmental policy, because you went back, like you said, to graduate school to work on this, what are the things that you're looking at differently that maybe somebody who is signing a petition or is looking to do work and help out or donate to a cause? So when you look at environmental policy, what are the steps that you're taking that maybe not the average person who's listening to this podcast, what's on your radar as opposed to what they're looking at or what you're seeing?
Yeah, policy, I think, gets a bad rap because it's just associated so closely with like, government and a heavy hand. But policy, public policy, let's remember the name is public policy, is really reflective of society's values and priorities at a given time. And it also really provides a framework for action, for accountability. So, for example, as I said, I worked on oil and gas issues for a long time. Without policy and associated regulations, there would be no accountability for polluters. So, we've got, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Wilderness Act, all of these bedrock environmental policies that have provided a framework for the last 50 or 60 years that basically say these things are of value: clean air, clean water, endangered species. These things matter. And the people who would deign to kill them, pollute the water, pollute the air, which also harms human beings, have to obey the law. And so I think as long as we're living in a society where the rule of law matters, and that we value the rule of law, then policy is the way to get there. So it goes hand in hand with law. And I would never say that policy is the be all and end all. Policy is the beginning. You pass a law, you pass a policy, you get associated regulations, and then you have to work like hell to maintain them and to implement them and to enforce them. So everything you mentioned, people signing a petition, people demonstrating in the streets, people going to testify at their city council, all of that in my mind is policy. It's activism, it's policy, it's a way of holding your elected officials accountable, and the people who would do the things you don't think they should do accountable. I hope that
So
makes some sense.
it does. And I want to hit on something too that I think Steve and I have started to encounter a little bit more on this podcast when we talk about policy and regulation and things that maybe have been in place for long periods of time. Do you find that there are a lot of pushbacks, I would say probably in the last 20 or so years, where you see people thinking that there's too much regulation and there's too many guardrails in place, and that progress for some believe that it may be hindered by some of the policy that's in place and that it's not revisited? Do you ever encounter that in the work that you're doing in not only fighting for the correct policy to be in place to, as you say, protect water and air and animals, which we'll get into? Where is the common ground or compromise that you can see that's found for those that are saying, yes, we need these things, but we want to progress and possibly, tweak the policy so that it might help as we move forward? Do you ever have those conversations?
Absolutely. I mean, I think every policy, and it's often baked into the policy, that there should be a review or revision. The Environmental Protection Agency, for example, is supposed to revisit a bunch of their policies every, on a set timeline. That's just one example. And so then that's always open to checking progress, seeing if there need to be changes. I know that a lot of people feel that there's too much policy, too much regulation, as you said. I think I'm a little biased toward having witnessed that when you take the policy and regulation away, people don't always behave in a way that is protective. And I'll give you one example, which will get us into wolves. The Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming would love, they're pushing very hard to take wolves off the endangered species list. But they never demonstrate that they can manage the animals in a responsible way. So if you were to take away that they say we're overregulated, it should not be the federal agencies coming here and telling us what to do. The states can handle it, the hunting community can handle it. But every time you move toward a loosening of the federal protection, a reaction to that is to increase hunting, is to try to decimate the population, is to throw open the door. So you have these wild swings, and then you come back and you say, well, that's why we need absolute complete federal protection. So I absolutely agree. I don't think there is enough common ground developed. I don't think there's enough dialogue. There is actually an effort underway under the Biden administration to have a national wolf conversation that would have brought in ranchers and farmers and advocates and animal rights activists. And unfortunately, that was just derailed, was just killed, like a lot of things are right now by the new administration. But that's just one issue. And I would say in my years I'm working in oil and gas, it was the same damn problem. It was like you'd go in and you'd fight with the oil and gas industry over a small regulatory change, like instead of putting your industrial scale well 300 feet from someone's house, could we get a regulation passed to do 500 feet or 1,000 feet? And if you didn't have that encoded in the law, they would put it as close as they needed to. They would never test your water. They would, and maybe I'm biased. I think there are companies that are good actors. I think there are hunters who are good actors. There are states that do the right thing. There are amazing biologists and regulators and state agencies. But all too often, when you take off the controls, terrible damage occurs. And that's just where I've come to after 25 years of working on these issues.
Yeah, I'm curious if there are policies floating around right now that are really fresh that maybe we haven't heard about that pertain to wolves specifically with the new administration kind of building momentum.
Yeah, there will be, let's all gear up for the perennial effort to take wolves off the endangered species list. And that goes hand in hand with some other species like grizzly bears. There'll probably be an effort to remove them from the Endangered Species Act, and to gut the act generally. So that's a perennial issue that we're watching really, really closely. And then there are these state wildlife action plans that come around every 10 years. So they're once in a decade opportunities for all 50 states to outline what their wildlife protection priorities are. And the Rewilding Institute is really engaged on that issue, particularly in the Northeast, and trying to make sure that carnivores are included on those lists. So the lists, they're called the Species of Greatest Conservation Need lists. They're not binding. These are guidelines. So they're policies, but they're guidelines more than binding. But they do set out the priorities for state wildlife agencies for the next decade. And so that's a really intense process that's underway now, again, in all 50 states. And it's something that people can get involved in. And we expect states are actually mandated to submit those policies by September to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We'll see what happens to them under the new administration. But that is a policy process that's underway now, and a lot of people are getting involved in it.
So when you look, so for the 10 years, because that seems like such a long period of time because I can possibly understand the reasoning for a length of time for policies or guidelines to be put in place to see how the wildlife reacts and then sort of revisit. But is there any discussion of why a decade and why not maybe even if you cut that in half or do every 4 years or something, because there could be either a lot of good or a lot of damage that can go within that 10-year period. Why only 10 years? Where was that set? What was the precedence for that type of thing for state wildlife action plans?
Yeah, the state wildlife action plans are actually connected to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and they have to be developed and submitted for states to receive to have a shot at the pot of federal funding for wildlife management in their states. But that's not all states do. I mean, there are lots of states, including your state of California, that revisits and revises its wildlife policies on particular species or on hunting quotas or a whole host of issues more frequently. But these plans are to kind of do a biological assessment, environmental assessment, and so they only are mandated to do them every 10 years. And again, they're frameworks. They're not, but they do set out priorities. And if a state doesn't include a species on that list, then they're not going to get the federal funding to work on that species. That doesn't mean they can't find other pots of money somewhere else to work on that species. But for example, it's looking like New York will not include wolf. Now, granted, wolves are not necessarily here, but there's indication they might be. There's certainly mixed canids. They're acting very wolfy. And so we're pushing hard to get New York to include the wolf on its list for the sole reason that we're talking 10 years, as you said, it's a long time. And if they're not on the list and more wolves start showing up, and there have been wolves including the one that was shot in Cooperstown, New York, just a couple of years ago. So if they don't, show up, if they're not on the list, then it's going to be harder to rationalize dedicating funds and time to their protection for the agency. So, but that again, that the swaps are broad guidelines, and we certainly would like to see wildlife agencies working on these issues all the time, and they do. They're constantly working on them.
So when they're working on this, right. So you're talking about getting the federal funds to be able to do the research or to start the research on any animal, any critter that's not on that list. So that could go anywhere between, insects to megafauna like a wolf
Oh
or something.
yeah,
Okay. So it goes
it's
around.
everything.
Got it.
It's fishes, it's invertebrates, it's insects, it's we're just the Northeast in particular has a few carnivores, wolves, cougars, lynx are starting to come back, but then bobcat have returned. But there are a few top carnivores, in particular wolf and cougar, that are just considered missing or gone, extirpated is the official term, from the state. So it's a process of convincing the states that there's enough sign that they could be coming back, or that they shouldn't exclude them because they play such a key ecological role. And there should be, because these plants last for 10 years, you should set it down so that you work toward their recovery.
Got it. So when we're looking at, because this will tie into, could you send us a couple of blogs or a series that you're working on for Rewilding Earth that discusses, I guess, this topic of mixed canids, these genetics, this conservation, and about basically the issue of evolving, because if wolves were essentially extirpated or eradicated from the Northeast to a degree, it seems as though, at least in the blogs that I was reading from you, that there's a mixture of a wolf coyote, like they've been mixing fairly well. I don't know about bobcat and lynx, and you said they're returning also. What's the intentionality of putting this information out there to sway the people in New York State to put the wolves and coyotes and lynx and bobcat on the swap? Are they not on there? And why is the genetics conservation point such a hot topic for anybody in that area?
Now, well, the genetics and conservation question is a hot topic generally now, and it's coming up even more. And I mean, you guys deal with mixed genetic animals too, in a different context. I'd love to hear about that. It's coming up generally, and it's actually something that I've only recently begun to understand and read about. And I think there are really interesting questions about how we respond to these mixed animals, because often they're interbreeding because of pressure, because of habitat development, because and climate change is the big wild card in this, because their habitat zones are coming into better connection with each other. Because often, I mean, for thousands of years, canids have been breeding with each other. And so there's also just all this amazing new genetic research that's possible now because of the methods and the science and the technology is evolving. So finding that, there are these mixed animals in the landscape, and their ecological niche could change. Like some of these mixed canids are starting in Ontario, for example, are starting to be able to take larger prey animals like deer and even moose. And are those wolves? Are they coyotes? How do we classify them? How do we protect them? And from a policy perspective, it's both fascinating and difficult, because, for example, the endangered species list, which a lot of states follow, and states have their own threatened and endangered species lists, are predicated on these kind of pure species. So there's wolf and there's coyote, there's lynx, there's bobcat. So what do you do with these hybrids? And if these hybrids are actually successfully breeding with each other, and they're producing offspring, and they're starting to fill certain ecological niches, do you just say, like, when is a wolf a wolf? When is a bobcat? If upon genetic testing they show mixes. So I don't have the answers. I'm not saying you should do one thing or the other. It is just a really intense debate that's coming up now because of the changes in the science, because the reality is in the ground, and because of habitat loss and climate change. That is just, I heard one person say the other day in reference to Alaska, like, how do you consider a certain habitat to be the sole habitat of a particular species when that habitat is completely changed, in reference to like a polar bear. When you don't have sea ice, then how do you argue that the polar bear belongs here and not somewhere else? What do you do when cold water fishes are seeking to survive? Because we're all driven by survival instinct. So when they're moving north to seek cold water and they encounter a similar species and interbreed with a warm water fish, does that hybrid now not deserve protection because it's part of the ecology and the ecosystem? So it's pretty intense debates and people come down all over. It's a tough question. So my goal with this blog series and just generally is to just explain these complicated issues in a simpler way for our readership, and so people understand this question. And then I would say I focused on canids because it is a really big policy challenge for the reasons I just explained for these state managers, and also because, frankly, some of these policy distinctions are absurd. Like, you have a federally and state protected wolf, but coyotes can be hunted 24/7, almost all year round. And then you've got the misidentification issue. I mean, the wildlife agencies on all levels know, for example, a certain number of grizzlies are killed every year by black bear hunters. A certain number of wolves are killed every year by coyote hunters. I was just on the Colorado Parks and Wildlife site today looking at some of their rules on bobcat hunting, and they're warning hunters, don't kill lynx because they're protected. And then you start looking and it's like, one has a black tip tail, one has a white tip tail, one has 1-inch tufts, one has 2-inch tufts. You start talking that way about the different animals and you're putting it all on the hunters to distinguish in the field. And it's just, these are tough questions. And certainly the similarity of appearance between coyotes and wolves, particularly in the Northeast, where the coyotes are much, much larger than what you have out west. They're wolfier, they're bulkier. They have a higher percentage of wolf DNA. So the wolves that have turned up in the Northeast have all been shot by coyote hunters. So it's tough questions.
Wow.
Yeah, I had a question, but you just answered it completely there about whether interbreeding creates complexity in terms of writing policy. Sounds like it absolutely does. But so at the moment, there isn't a widely used approach to writing policy for hybrid species.
No, there isn't. And there are some geneticists whose work I cover in the blog series too, who are raising this question. At the current moment, I would not advocate with criticizing. I'm not going to criticize the Endangered Species Act because it focuses on singular species. I mean, that's been around for 50 years. It's a remarkable tool. It is one of our strongest, most bedrock environmental laws, and is absolutely needed to ensure biodiversity and to protect animals. And yet it is very, species specific. So maybe one day in time, maybe not in my lifetime, we will evolve to having a policy framework for hybrids, or for focusing more on ecological function and ecological health, and which animals help advance that, rather than just, species specific. And it's really hard, like with the case of the polar bear, like, their habitats are disappearing. So how do you protect them in that case?
Yeah. When you brought up something interesting too about framework in policy, what are some of the challenges when developing policy in this situation? Obviously, hybrids are a different story altogether at this point. But when you're trying to create a framework for policy that's going to not only protect the interests of the animal, but also look at humans on the other side and land and everything else, I'm sure there's a lot of different scenarios you have to go through. What's when you start to write something or start to build something that's going to become policy or law eventually? What are one or two key things that you look for as you're doing like the research on this genetics and conservation for Rewilding Earth? What are some of the things you look at specifically, Nadia?
I think you always have to start with what's the end goal. Are you seeking to be more protective? Are you seeking to get the state to act in a different way? I'm, often, and I would say this harkens back to my work on oil and gas too. Sometimes I just want the agencies to do their damn jobs. So if they are mandated to do certain things and they're not doing it, then that's often a key goal, to either write the comments or try to get a regulatory change in place, that will push them to do their jobs. And so a lot of this activity, like around the state wildlife action plans, is it's an exercise in convincing the wildlife agencies to do their jobs, and that they have a mandate to look at these particular species or to manage for the whole ecosystem, or that these are, in the case of misidentification of coyotes and wolves, they are mandated to actually protect endangered species. And so if there are wolves on the landscape and they're getting shot by coyote hunters, then we really need them, and there are organizations working on this all through the Northeast. We really need them to do better hunter education. And that's a policy action that the states need to take, and putting out one flyer that has a picture of a coyote and a picture of a wolf, it may not be sufficient. Like, if they're still getting shot, and if there aren't any hunters who've been prosecuted, but they just killed a federally protected species. So, and I think most hunters wouldn't want to do that. And this, of course, gets into the whole issue of the rampant, unregulated coyote hunting that exists nationwide, and why certain canids are treated like vermin and certain canids are not. Um, I don't know if I can ask you a similar question. I mean, you guys deal with mixed canids, and I was looking at some of the pack members at Wolf Connection. They're phenomenal animals, but I imagine you encounter a lot of policy and regulatory gray areas around the ownership of wolf dog hybrids, and when is it a wolf, when's it a dog. Some states outlaw it, some states don't. Curious how you guys approach that.
I mean, it's a fairly, I mean, for us, for the sanctuary, it's a pretty, I don't want to say it's black and white, but I mean, if there's a wolf dog in need that we are able to take in, you know that's in a situation when we're talking about, say, backyard breeding, roadside attraction, domestic ownership, anything that is um going to give a better life for that animal, we certainly jump into action in any way that we can. Where it becomes tricky, and even here in the state of California, this goes into different towns, different counties, different whatever have certain rules. So there are counties in California where you can actually, I believe, legally own a wolf dog. It's the same, I think, as in any other state. So you're really talking about dancing around those things in terms of us being able to give sanctuary or help out any of these hybrids. It's typically at the discretion for the sanctuary and for the folks that are in the pack or the wolf care department to really look at that and say, it's really about information, right? It's the same thing you do with policy. It's looking at the physical traits, the behavioral traits, and saying, okay, is this actually a wolf dog, or is this an animal that was bred to look like one but is really just a shepherd or a husky or a malamute or another breed that has maybe features, but sometimes it's a puppy or it's a 2-year-old that just, it needs farmland or it needs to be out in the open. So there's a lot of things around that. It's not necessarily policy.
There is some policy around animals that are over a certain percent wolf.
Yes.
So and that would mean that the sanctuary has to follow specific regulations for those particular animals, which would be different than a very low content animal.
Yeah.
So do you do genetic sampling, like you do
We
DNA tests?
we don't genetically test, but we use a lot of phenotyping. So we look at the physical traits, we look at the behavior, and we have a very good track record of looking at it and saying, okay, this is we can tell, this is a low content, mid content, high content.
It's
and
fairly
understand,
easy. I mean,
it's fairly easy to
fair,
be able to do it.
Like,
yeah.
because we've been around wolves for years, it's not that difficult to see if an animal's just been bred to look like a wolf versus is very high content wolf. They do not communicate like dogs, and the further away from a dog they get, the less familiar the communication is, or the same triggers mean polar opposite things, because the remnant language that the dog possesses is not communicating the same thing that ancestrally wolves are communicating. So it's almost, the sanctuary is not 100% all the time, but I'd be pretty confident that.
Yeah.
So if I'm understanding correctly, it's a mix. It's a blend of kind of physical appearance and behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I would say the same thing goes for, eastern coyotes and the potential for wolves being on the landscape. And that's
Right.
where, you get into the misidentification. But they're the Maine Wolf Coalition. I always like to give them a shout out. They have trail cams all over the North Woods of Maine. They are taking them some unbelievable pictures. The range of wild canids on the landscape is breathtaking, both in terms of fur color, of size, of eyes, of shape of the ears, all the things that you would normally use to distinguish between a wolf and a coyote. And it's an incredible range. And I guess I personally, is again, just advocating for the wild and setting aside advocating for particular species, find it incredibly exciting that there are these animals that have managed to survive in an environment where you can hunt coyotes all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they're doing what they need to do. And whether they're, it would be interesting, maybe you guys, to borrow some of the Wolf Connection expertise on deciding this. I mean, I think scientists come down around, like, once you're above 60-70% wolf DNA, you pretty much are acting wolfy.
Yeah.
So
there's a couple in our pack that I can tell you right off the bat that, if you look, just look at them, and Steven's right, the behavior and the like you said, the triggers, which I guess isn't, I don't know, not, what I'm saying, or like the behavioral aspects, you're like, okay, yeah, different things.
Right.
You can absolutely tell the difference with that. And yeah, we look at some of the low contents and we're like, there's and unfortunately a lot of it, Nadia, is labeling. So if you label an animal, whether it's got a certain amount of percentage genetically as wolf, if you label it as a wolf dog, that's a whole, you really shrink the process for the specific animal. So now what you have is you've labeled it as a wolf dog. It goes in the system as a wolf dog. It's very tough to take that label off. And so that's why we really try about educating and informing people. Don't put the label on unless you are absolutely positively sure that there is something in there. Because once you do that, the animals cannot, they get adopted out in certain places. I can't speak for every place, every state, every town. Everybody's different. But for the majority of the time, that it is going to shorten that animal's lifespan dramatically, because now it has to go to a sanctuary, or it has to go to a place that has, containment that is able to hold a wolf dog. And so certain fences, certain things. So yeah, it's a lot about just educating that. But Steven's right. We've had a proven track record over the course of time that, and yeah, I don't think anybody's perfect, but we are pretty damn close to understanding those phenotypes.
Yeah, well, I do find it, let's just say, fascinating and frustrating, like from a policy perspective of deciding which animals deserve protection, and some of the absurdities that come up in making these distinctions, or again, because I think you can probably guess, I think it's wrong that coyotes are hunted 24/7 in many states without any limits on how many you can kill, and so on. And we even have these wildlife killing contests that focus on coyotes, and try to just kill the largest number and the biggest ones possible. And so this kind of abject desire to blow them away. And then on the other hand, you have members of society who, will do anything they can to get a coyote or a wolfy looking dog, and spend thousands of dollars on that animal, and try to, live in a state where that's legal. And so you've got this very sort of like schizophrenic approach to canids, and that makes for very difficult, often contradictory and heated policy making around how to protect certain
Yeah.
animals.
I mean, does it
Yeah.
feel there's normally a difference in opinion between the federal government and state governments when it comes to wildlife? And why does it seem that that's the case? And how do we as civilians determine which entity has the most educated opinion on these topics?
Yeah, I think it's a hard one. And, it's not like wolves or grizzlies or any of the other top carnivores got onto the endangered species list because they were plentiful and thriving. They got on them because they were endangered. And so from a state, the states that are managing for wildlife, or any of us who are becoming engaged in this issues, we tend to gravitate toward to action when the animals are in danger or when they're in decline. And so a wolf still seems rare, but of course people go to Alaska to hunt them where they're not rare. Or another species would be bobcat. State managers will say, well, they've made this amazing comeback and now they're everywhere and there are millions of them, so they no longer need to be subjected to protections. And so I think there's a lot of ping ponging back and forth, which is a really difficult question for anyone interested in working on these issues from a policy and regulatory perspective. Should we manage for protection of the animals, again, for their ecological function, and because maybe hunting them to throw them in a dumpster, which is what happens at the wildlife killing contests, which are legal in 40 states. Killing them just to throw them away, or killing them to line a parka hood, which coyote fur is used for sometimes, and bobcat fur is not really how we want to be approaching wildlife protection. Or should we only care when they're on the brink of extinction? And I would say let's gravitate toward the former, particularly in a world of rapidly changing climate and ecosystems going topsy-turvy, and we need to protect as much as we can.
I mean, do you ever look at if we go back to the swap? I just feel like that's easier than staying state wildlife action plan. And plus it's cool. Are there any actions to protect, because you talked about land also, and habitat loss or destruction via the topsy-turviness of populations between ungulates, not enough predators, so on and so forth, and wanting to include these carnivores specifically in the New York State wildlife action plan, right? The cougars and the wolves, or these hybrids that you're working hard to get on there. Is there an approach that maybe, if we talk about protecting certain trees, certain areas, and realizing that, hey, this habitat's getting smaller, if we protect these things and natural corridors, that these populations could regulate themselves as opposed to having to figure out numbers and things of that sort? Has that ever entered the conversation, as opposed to strictly just looking at the critter and saying, you have X number, you have Y number, you have Z number, we're going to take Z out, leave X and Y together, and revisit Z in another 10 years?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I was just reading some scientific articles yesterday, as a matter of fact, about the ability of cougar and wolf populations to self-regulate, and how much the science bears that out. And California actually came up as an example with your mountain lion population, that when you have these stable family units or these stable packs, they tend to be, and the same goes with coyotes, as a matter of fact, that blowing them away often ends up with fragmented packs and more breeding, which is why their numbers always stay high. And so I think, that this question of in the swaps, if I'm and correct me if I'm not understanding the question accurately, that it does set out a plan for 10 years, but I'm assuming the state biologists and the state managers will see what's going on and will make changes along the way. And the land question is really important, because before you would develop a plan for a particular species, or in the case of cougar, all we're asking the states to do is to study the feasibility of reintroduction. With wolves, they seem to have the ability to come back on their own, and they have been appearing in the Northeast, but with cougar in the Northeast, at least, and in many other states, you'd have to actively reintroduce them. So we want them to study the feasibility. And part of that feasibility is their suitable habitat. And I don't know, some of these carnivores are remarkably adaptable. I mean, right, you've got mountain lions in Los Angeles is the crowning example. You've also got, whether that's a good thing is a debate, there's intense debate about that. But you've also got wolves living in heavily populated parts of the world, like farms in Italy and villages in Poland. And coyotes are thriving in Queens and Long Island, for goodness sake. So, I think that also challenges wildlife managers and the public to broaden our concept of what is suitable habitat and what are we managing for in our current point in time. And so that goes back again to what we were discussing before, are some of these numerical targets or some of our approaches just a little too stale and old. And if we could learn to coexist better, if we could use non-lethal control and reduce conflicts with wildlife, would we open that up? And I think these are part of the comments that we're all submitting to the agencies around the swaps that we want them to take into consideration. But they're biologists and they're managers, and they'll have to figure out how they want to do this.
I want to touch on just quickly the Northeast Wolf Recovery Alliance, because you do some work with them as well. How do they overlap with any of the work in the swap? Are they leading the charge for a lot of this research on the wild canid genetics? Are they? I know it's the Wolf Recovery Alliance. Are they dipping their toe into any of the help with the cougar or bobcat or lynx or anything? Are they strictly working with wolf recovery or coyote recovery policy as opposed to the whole swath of predators that they're talking about?
There's a lot of just from a practical perspective, there's a lot of overlap in the organizations that are working on the swaps and that are working in the Wolf Recovery Alliance. Not everybody's working on both, but a lot of us are. Rewilding Institute, Project Coyote, Center for Biological Diversity, and then there are more state and locally based organizations within the Wolf Recovery Alliance that are doing tremendous work in trying to get at this genetic question. So they're doing SCAT surveys. SCAT has proven to be a remarkable wealth of genetic information, and it's easily collected. And so they're out in the Adirondacks and in northern Maine collecting what could be coyote scat, what could be wolf scat, and collaborating with some labs that are doing their own studies on wild canids and admixtures and are interested in having samplings. So Maine Wolf Coalition that I mentioned before, the Northeast Ecological Recovery Society, couple of independent researchers who are part of the Wolf Recovery Alliance, and they're doing that work. And we certainly, those of us who are developing like the more technical comments for the swaps, rely a lot on that kind of on the ground work and the science that's going on.
So is there anything that you, because we're going to wrap in just a moment, is there anything that you would put out to anybody who's listening to this, either about something maybe we didn't touch on that you want to give a couple minutes to, or something that you would say, if you're interested in this and want to learn more about not only, I guess, the recovery efforts, but about the policy aspect and how to effectively, learn about this, read up about it, what are some things or some advice you would give to anybody who's listening?
I would say, first of all, probably most of your listeners do this anyway, but like open your minds to thinking about what we have on the ground, what might be out there, and what we could accommodate on the landscape going forward, just because of all the rapid ecological changes happening, and particularly with climate change and the ability of some of these animals to adapt to a changing ecology and to survive. We talked about hybridization. It really is both. It can be really, really depressing and really scary to watch the decline in biodiversity and the loss of the natural world. And I think there's also and I tell myself this when I'm getting up in the morning, there's a lot of hope there too, because these animals are remarkably resilient. Look who I'm talking to, right? That you guys base a lot of your work on the concept of strength and resiliency and healing. And so I'm assuming your listeners are interested in that concept. And a lot of these animals will do this if we get out of the way and we give them space and we offer them sanctuary and protection in the natural world. They will be able to go on. And then switching gears to a really, really practical situation, not to get too political, but we are entering a period now where we are going to see a lot of upside downness with our policies. And I would ask any of your listeners who are interested in doing this work to keep your eyes out for action alerts if you belong to any wildlife protection organization. Center for Biological Diversity, Project Coyote, Rewilding Institute are some, but there are many others, Sierra Club, National Wildlife Federation. Just, we have to keep wolves on the endangered species list. If they are removed, it will literally be open season, and we will dial back the clock, decades of successful effort at recovery. And the same goes for for grizzlies and mountain lions and other carnivores. So please get involved and try to keep those protections in place. It's so vital.
My last question for you, Nadia, is when you hear the word wolf, what's the thing that comes to your mind?
Ancient soul. I look at a wolf, I hear the howl of a wolf, look in its eyes, and there's some primordial and noble connection for all of us and our feet on the planet, and the wolf just embodies that.
I think that's a first. That's like, I think I haven't heard ancient soul.
Say?
Oh, no, I haven't think I've heard ancient soul. So it's always good. Every time I ask this question, almost 250 times, I've gotten pretty much a different answer every time, which is pretty cool.
Oh, it's interesting.
Nadia Steinzor, thank you so much for breaking down this policy work, giving us a deeper understanding of what goes into this and what people can do for it. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the amazing work you're all doing. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show and to meet you guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was great to meet you too. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Hang tight while we sign off. House to y'all out there. We'll be with you next time. Bye, everybody. Looking for more information about Wolf Connection or the podcast? Please visit our website at wolfconnection.org, where you can donate, sponsor a wolf, or become a volunteer.